Hi, I'm Elspeth Jackson, the author of Rag Rugs, Pillows and More. And I also run a website called Ragged Life where you can get all of your rag rug tools, supplies and inspiration. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be teaching you definitively how to properly use a rag rug gauge. So for anyone who's a rag rug beginner, one of the traditional British techniques of rag rugging is called shaggy rag rugging, or it's sometimes called clippy, proggy, proddy. It all very much depends on where you're from in the country, what you will refer to it as. But I'm a soft southerner, so I call it shaggy rag rugging. For this particular technique, you need to cut your strips into roughly 7 centimetre long pieces. If you had to cut them all individually, it would take you forever to do, and they'd probably be all a bit skew width and all different lengths. So the rag rug gauge is a really good tool for helping you cut them simply, quickly and easily. So here we go. So the first stage of shaggy rag rugging is to cut your rags up. And this is an old t-shirt that I've actually rolled up into a tube. If you want to see how I deconstruct full items of clothing or offcuts, then head over to my other video, which is all about preparing fabrics for rag rugging. But I've cheated and gone a step in front. So with this tube of fabric, the first stage is we want to create long strips of fabric that are roughly about 1.5 centimetres in width. So we do this by using really strong rag rug scissors to cut through lots of layers at the same time. And you can see these scissors are making pretty easy work of going through, about 10 layers of fabric. But you're basically wanting to quickly cut up all of your strips. And it doesn't matter if your strips are a bit wiggly, it doesn't matter if some of them are longer than others or some of them have got slight imperfections. The nice thing about rag rugging is that all of these imperfections won't show up, as rag rugging is supposed to look a little bit kind of disheveled anyway, particularly the shaggy technique. So I've got quite a few strips to be going with there. We're now going to learn how to use the miracle tool that is the rag rug gauge. So this is essentially a wooden block with a deep, wide groove at the top. The Ragged Life gauges have been designed by me, so they kind of fit a few of the kind of preferences that I have. So for example, I've made sure that the groove at the top is nice and wide and nice and deep. So when you're putting your scissors through it, they don't get nicked, because the last thing us crafters want is our really nice expensive fabric scissors getting destroyed by a wooden block. So that's one of the things I've done. I also like using a hardwood for this, just so that your gauge will last you a lifetime, because some people skimp and they use softer wood that doesn't last as long. So how do we use it? Once we've cut all of our strips, we grab roughly 6 strips at the same time. Generally, the thinner a fabric is, the more strips you can cut on the gauge at the same time. The thicker a fabric is, the fewer you can do at the same time. So with things like fleece that are quite thick, you can only use about 3 or 4 strips on the gauge at the same time. With things like chiffon that are very thin and floaty, you can actually use probably 10 or 12. So just play around, see how the fabrics feel, and you'll soon get a good feel for the gauge. So first step is we hold the ends of our strips so that they're aligned with that groove at the top. For all you perfectionists out there, you dressmakers, you patchworkers, you quilters, everything about rag rugging is very inexact. So you don't need to be millimetre perfect, it just has to be vaguely aligned with the groove. You then wrap around and along the gauge. And there are a couple of things that you have to watch out for. The first one is the fact that when you cross this groove at the top, you want to cross it quite flat to it, rather than going diagonal. That means that you can actually overlap your strips slightly as you go along. The second bit of advice I've got when doing this is don't pull your strips really tight. If you're using a fabric that has lots of elastic in, it will stretch the fabric and it'll actually mean that you'll end up with shorter strips than you're looking for. But what you're doing is you're wrapping them around. If you had any shorter strips as you were going along, you would trap them into the gauge with the longer strips by wrapping them over the top. And you keep going until you're all nicely secured in. And you want to make sure that you're kind of basically nice and flat and there's a similar thickness across the gauge. So you definitely don't want parts of the gauge to be really thick and parts of the gauge to be really narrow. That will end up with different lengths of strips for shaggy rag rugging. Another little tip that I've got is some people find it quite difficult to wrap the strips confidently around the gauge. If you're struggling and you feel like everything's all over the place and it's a bit kind of a disaster, it actually sometimes helps to turn the gauge rather than turning the strips. So you kind of keep these ones nice and secure at the top, but you basically just wind the gauge around rather than wrapping the strips around. And once again, it's the same process of keep going until you're all nicely secured in. However you get to this stage, you then, this is the fun part, cut down the centre of the gauge. And all these pieces that you're left with are roughly the same length for doing shaggy rag rugging. You might have some slightly smaller pieces like these ones here. Those are where your strips didn't reach all the way around the gauge. They're probably a little bit short, so you can discard them. But most of them are all the same length and they're absolutely fabulous for making shaggy rag rugs. So I would say that the gauge is really good for cutting strips to the right length for things like rugs, cushions, wreaths, anything where you want real texture to it and for it to be nice and plush. But as I said, it's a really, really simple time-saving tool, and I hope you find it useful and easy to use, and I hope this tutorial was good.